The morning sun cast long, golden beams across the steps of the towering courthouse, glinting off the polished marble and gilded brass fixtures. A crowd had already begun to gather outside, their chatter and camera clicks blending into a low hum of anticipation. Keanu Reeves arrived in a sleek black suit, his expression calm but his eyes sharp, scanning the gathered press and spectators with quiet awareness. Despite the serene demeanor, there was a palpable tension in the air, as if everyone present sensed that something extraordinary, something shocking was about to unfold. Reporters jostled for position. Cameras aimed at the star actor who had, against all odds, found himself entangled in this high-profile courtroom drama. Fans craned their necks, waving signs and whispering excitement, while a few curious bystanders simply gawked, unable to resist the magnetic presence of someone so iconic in real life. Keanu's steps were measured, almost meditative, and every movement seemed deliberate. He paused for a brief moment at the top of the courthouse stairs, glancing up at the towering columns that framed the grand entrance, drawing a subtle inhale as if preparing himself for the storm he was about to enter. Inside, the courtroom was cavernous, filled with polished wood, dark leather chairs, and a sense of institutional authority that weighed heavily on everyone present. The sunlight streaming through, the tall arched windows created striking patterns on the floor, giving the space a surreal, almost cinematic quality. Keanu walked down the long aisle, his presence commanding yet understated. Every eye in the room seemed to follow him, not with hostility, but with an intense, almost reverential curiosity. Reporters scribbled furiously, documenting his every gesture, every inflection of expression. The audience, a mix of legal professionals, journalists, and random spectators, shifted in their seats, murmuring in hushed tones. Some whispered in awe at the actor's composed demeanor, while others speculated nervously about what the judge might say. Keanu's lawyer walked beside him, papers and files clutched tightly, yet even she seemed momentarily awed by the gravity of the moment. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. It felt as if the courtroom itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between celebrity and authority. As he reached the front of the courtroom, Keanu took his seat at the defense table, straightening his suit jacket and placing his hands calmly on the polished surface. He glanced briefly at the judge's bench, noting the stern, unyielding expression on the woman presiding over the case. The courtroom felt alive with tension, each spectator aware that they were witnessing the opening act of what promised to be a historic confrontation. Cameras flashed once more, capturing the moment with a kind of reverent urgency, and in that instant, the air seemed to crackle with expectation. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the gavel struck the polished wood with a sharp, authoritative sound. Judge Veronica Hargrave, a woman known for her unrelenting demeanor and razor-sharp tongue, leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowing like a hawk assessing its prey. She scanned the room, her gaze finally settling on Keanu Reeves. The air seemed to thicken, even the sunlight streaming through the high windows could not soften the electric tension that now gripped every corner of the courtroom. Then, without preamble, she spoke. Her words cut through the air like a blade. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "it's remarkable that someone of your reputation could find themselves in such a situation. Frankly, I expected better judgment from a man who has spent a lifetime in the public eye. But then again, appearances can be deceiving." A stunned silence followed. The courtroom collectively froze. Reporters' pens hovered above their notepads. Spectators exchanged incredulous glances. Even Keanu's lawyer, who had anticipated a stern judge, could not hide the flicker of shock on her face. The insult was sharp, public, and undeniably personal. Whispers began to ripple through the audience, each one growing louder, as people tried to process what had just been said. Keanu, however, did not flinch. He sat straight, his eyes fixed on the judge, his expression calm, almost meditative. There was a brief pause as if he were weighing his next words, a subtle shift in posture that spoke of quiet confidence rather than submission. The audience, sensing his controlled reaction, leaned in, collectively holding their breath. His calmness made the judge's sharp words feel even more brazen, more shocking. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Reeves?" Judge Hargrave continued, her tone now a mixture of irritation and incredulity. Or are we to witness another celebrity spectacle where charm and fame substitute for accountability? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some spectators gasped audibly, others whispered furiously, and a few reporters leaned forward, sensing that this confrontation might be far more explosive than the headlines could capture. The atmosphere was electric. Every eye in the room seemed glued to the scene unfolding between the star actor and the intimidating authority of the bench. Keanu took a deep breath, his composure unshaken. There was a subtle intensity in his gaze, a quiet fire beneath the calm exterior. The contrast between his serene demeanor and the judge's aggressive theatrics created a palpable tension that radiated through the room. Even the lawyers shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that the courtroom had transformed from a mere trial into a dramatic confrontation, one where words were as potent as evidence. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The judge, usually the uncontested center of authority, found herself challenged by the sheer presence and calm authority of her defendant. Keanu Reeves remained seated, his posture straight, hands resting lightly on the polished oak surface of the defense table. The courtroom was still buzzing with the big aftershock of the judge's unexpected insult, but Keanu's presence seemed to calm the storm rather than fuel it. His eyes, sharp yet composed, met Judge Hargrave's gaze without flinching. There was a quiet intensity in that look, a subtle assertion of strength that made even the most seasoned legal observers in the room pause. The judge's words had been cutting, designed to humiliate in front of everyone present, but Keanu gave nothing in return that could be called overt emotion. His calm demeanor was, in itself, a statement. He would not be rattled. He would not be manipulated by theatrics, and he would not allow anger to dictate his actions. Yet beneath that serenity, a spark of restrained tension flickered, an awareness that this was a test of patience, composure, and presence. Around him, the audience reacted in quiet awe. Fans leaned forward in their seats, mouths slightly open. Caught between concern and admiration, reporters' pens scribbled frantically, attempting to capture not just the facts of the trial, but the essence of the tension radiating from the defense table. Even the court stenographer paused briefly, sensing the weight of the moment. Every eye in the courtroom seemed glued to Keanu, studying the calm face that contrasted so starkly with the judge's sharp, aggressive energy. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but silence, punctuated only by the faint rustle of papers and the subtle creak of the courtroom benches. Then Keanu allowed himself the smallest shift, a slow, deliberate adjustment of his suit jacket. It was almost imperceptible, but to those watching closely it conveyed readiness, composure, and confidence. He did not speak immediately, letting the weight of his presence do much of the talking. The tension was palpable, like a charged wire waiting to spark. Finally, when he did speak, it was with a calm, steady voice that carried through the courtroom without aggression. "Your Honor," he began, each syllable measured, deliberate. "I respect this court and the process it represents, but I also believe that respect must be mutual." His words were simple, yet they carried a subtle power, a quiet assertion that dignity could not be commanded through insults or theatrics. The courtroom responded immediately. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. A few gasps of surprise punctuated the silence, and the press leaned in, sensing that this was a turning point. Keanu's gaze never wavered, and in that moment, the dynamics of the courtroom began to shift. The judge, who had wielded words like weapons moments before, found herself facing a calm counterbalance. The courtroom seemed to recognize it collectively. This was no ordinary trial. The tension between authority and integrity, theatrics and composure, had transformed the room into a stage. The courtroom air grew heavier as the first witness was called to the stand. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit, clutching a folder of documents, walked with careful steps toward the raised witness platform. Every eye followed him, the tension in the room almost tangible. Keanu Reeves sat upright at the defense table, his hands lightly clasped in front of him, maintaining his calm composure. Reporters leaned forward in anticipation. This testimony could shift the tone of the trial dramatically. The witness began to speak, his voice slightly trembling at first. "On the night in question," he said, "I observed—" His words were careful, measured, and precise, describing events in detail that were critical to Keanu's defense. A hush fell over the courtroom as people strained to catch every word, the importance of the testimony hanging in the air like a delicate thread. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire courtroom had collectively drawn in a breath, waiting for the revelation of truth. Then Judge Hargrave intervened. With a sharp movement of her hand and a forceful tap of the gavel, she cut the witness off mid-sentence. "Enough," she barked, her voice cold and commanding. "This testimony is irrelevant and frankly highly exaggerated. Are we to take your word over documented evidence and fact?" Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, her tone dripping with condescension. The courtroom gasped collectively at the sheer audacity of the interruption. Witnesses, lawyers, and spectators alike were taken aback. Few had ever seen such a blatant dismissal in a public courtroom, especially from a judge of her stature. Keanu's lawyer shifted in her seat, visibly frustrated. But Keanu himself remained unflinching. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on the judge, projecting a quiet intensity that drew the attention of everyone present. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath again. Some spectators whispered to each other in disbelief, while others murmured encouragement to Keanu, sensing the injustice unfolding before them. The press scribbled furiously, eager to capture not only the facts of the case, but the drama that now dominated the room. The witness, though shaken, attempted to continue, his voice firmer this time. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the evidence clearly supports my account," he began, but the judge interrupted again, dismissing him with a pointed, sarcastic remark that questioned both his credibility and his intelligence. The audience reacted immediately. Gasps, shocked exclamations, and scattered whispers filled the air. Even seasoned attorneys exchanged glances, astonished at the blatant contempt for the witness and the procedural decorum. Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw set in quiet determination. His calmness contrasted sharply with the judge's growing irritation. It was clear that the courtroom, which had been tense before, had now reached a boiling point. The courtroom, already charged with tension, seemed to ripple with a new, almost electric energy. Every spectator had been watching intently, hanging on to every word of the witness's interrupted testimony, and now their reactions began to manifest. Gasps and whispered conversations filled the room, punctuated occasionally by the scratch of pens as reporters hurried to document not just the trial, but the drama unfolding before them. Even the most composed observers could not hide their astonishment at the audacity of the judge and the calm, unwavering presence of Keanu Reeves. Fans in the front rows leaned forward, their expressions a mix of concern and admiration. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the judge had spoken to Keanu with such public disdain. Others exchanged nervous glances, murmuring quietly among themselves, as if collectively deciding whether to intervene verbally or remain silent witnesses to the unfolding spectacle. Their emotions were raw and visible, each reaction magnifying the tension in the room. Reporters scrambled to their cameras and notebooks, eager to capture every detail. The judge's sharp words and dismissive gestures were being recorded, not just as testimony, but as headlines waiting to happen. Their pens moved furiously, capturing the exact phrasing of her insults, while their lenses zoomed in on Keanu's calm composure, trying to frame the contrast in a single telling shot. The room seemed to pause between moments, as if each observer were aware that they were witnessing something historic. The legal professionals present were equally captivated. Lawyers who had seen countless courtroom dramas were now whispering to each other in disbelief. Even the court clerks, usually silent and impassive, exchanged uneasy glances. The blatant insult from Judge Hargrave had broken protocol, and the courtroom's decorum seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. Yet Keanu's serene presence acted like a counterweight, stabilizing the scene even as shockwaves radiated outward. As the judge's interruptions continued, subtle signs of outrage began to emerge among the audience. A few spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, hands tightening around the arms of chairs. Others whispered words of encouragement to Keanu, though no sound carried to the bench. The energy in the room was almost tangible, a mixture of disbelief, anticipation, and awe. The people were reacting not only to the insult itself, but to the way Keanu handled it, poised, calm, and unflinching. Even beyond the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The flashes of cameras, the scribbling of reporters, and the collective murmurs created a kind of hum. A backdrop of expectancy that seemed to resonate through every corner of the room. Keanu's presence had transformed the courtroom into a stage, and every person, from fan to journalist to legal expert, was now a participant in the drama. The courtroom, still buzzing from the public's reaction, seemed to hang in a delicate balance as Keanu Reeves shifted slightly in his seat. His movements were measured, almost imperceptible, yet carried an unmistakable sense of intent. There was no sudden outburst, no dramatic gesture, just the quiet authority of a man completely in control of himself, which, in this charged atmosphere, spoke louder than any words could. The judge, accustomed to commanding the room with intimidation and sarcasm, felt the subtle shift immediately. For the first time, her dominance felt questioned. Keanu leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Judge Hargrave with calm determination. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, controlled, and precise. "Your Honor," he said, choosing his words with deliberate care, "I understand the role this court plays in upholding justice. However, respect is a two-way street. I am here to provide testimony and evidence, and I hope we can maintain the decorum that ensures truth is not lost in theatrics." The courtroom felt the weight of his words instantly. A soft murmur ran through the audience, punctuated by the quiet click of cameras and the shuffle of papers. Keanu's tone was calm, yet firm enough to convey authority without aggression. The power of his presence, the way he carried himself, the way his voice commanded attention, began to subtly undermine the judge's earlier display of control. Spectators could feel the dynamics of authority shifting in real time, a silent battle being waged through poise and composure, rather than volume and insult. Judge Hargrave's lips tightened imperceptibly, her brow furrowing as she tried to maintain control. She had underestimated the effect of Keanu's calm response. His words had not just defended his own dignity, they had also resonated with the audience. A few spectators leaned forward, their eyes narrowing with newfound respect, while some whispered quietly among themselves, noting the surprising confidence and eloquence of the man in front of them. The press scribbled furiously, capturing the moment that was quickly turning into a turning point in the trial. Keanu continued, his hands resting lightly on the table. "The witness testimony, the evidence, and the facts are what should guide our deliberations, not personal judgment or theatrics. I trust that this court will allow truth to prevail." His statement, measured and sincere, sent a ripple through the courtroom. Lawyers exchanged glances, some nodding imperceptibly, recognizing the strategic power in Keanu's calm defiance. The audience, previously shocked and disoriented, began to shift in their seats, leaning toward him, their energy quietly rooting for integrity over intimidation. The judge's gavel, once the unquestioned instrument of control, now felt less formidable. Keanu's presence, his composure, and his quiet insistence on respect had begun to reshape the courtroom dynamics. For a fleeting moment, Judge Veronica Hargrave's stern facade began to crack. The quiet, measured authority that had once dominated the courtroom now faced a subtle but undeniable challenge. Keanu Reeves, with his calm composure and strategic words, had shifted the energy in the room, and the judge, unused to such unflappable resistance, felt it immediately. Her gavel, once a symbol of absolute control, now seemed insufficient to command the room. She banged it sharply against the bench, the sound echoing through the courtroom. "Enough," she snapped, her voice strained with irritation. The audience flinched at the intensity of her tone, sensing her rising frustration. Her hands trembled slightly as she leaned forward, glaring at Keanu with a mixture of disbelief and anger. It was the first time anyone had truly seen the judge falter in public, and the courtroom reacted instantly. Spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances, murmurs of astonishment rippling through the room like a tidal wave. Keanu, seated with calm poise, allowed the judge's outburst to wash over him without reaction. There was no tremor in his voice, no sudden movement to betray impatience. He simply adjusted his posture slightly, his gaze steady, almost inviting the judge to continue her theatrics. Every subtle gesture communicated quiet confidence, turning the courtroom's energy further in his favor. The contrast between her flaring temper and his serene presence became the focal point of the entire scene. The judge's interruptions became more frequent and sharper. "Are you deliberately testing this court's patience, Mr. Reeves?" she demanded, her voice now rising slightly above normal conversational tone. "Your calmness is infuriating, and I will not allow it to undermine the authority of this bench." Her hand shook as she gestured, emphasizing every word, but her fury only highlighted the courtroom's growing awareness that her dominance was being challenged. Spectators were spellbound. Fans of Keanu leaned forward, whispering encouragement, while reporters scribbled furiously, sensing a headline-making moment in progress. The courtroom itself seemed to vibrate with tension, every whisper and gasp amplifying the intensity. Even seasoned attorneys were visibly unsettled, noting the unusual dynamic that had shifted the traditional courtroom hierarchy. The audience now witnessed a rare spectacle, authority being confronted not with aggression, but with calm resilience. Keanu finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "Your Honor, I am here to respect this court and its proceedings. But respect is reciprocal. If the goal is truth, then theatrics serve no one." His words landed like a quiet explosion. A wave of murmurs ran through the courtroom. Spectators leaned in, some nodding subtly, others exchanging astonished looks. The judge's attempt to dominate the room was faltering. The courtroom was beginning to side, at least in perception, with the calm, dignified presence of the defendant. The courtroom atmosphere had reached a fever pitch. Judge Veronica Hargrave, visibly flustered, tried to assert control, but the momentum had subtly shifted toward Keanu Reeves. His calm composure and quiet authority had begun to reshape perceptions in the room, and now it was his legal team's moment to capitalize on the change. His lead attorney, a sharp, confident woman named Claire Donovan, rose from her seat and approached the judge with measured precision, holding a stack of documents and photographic evidence. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm yet polite, "we have presented clear, indisputable evidence regarding the events in question. I request the court allow this evidence to be reviewed without further interruption or personal commentary." The words carried authority, and the courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively, eager to see how the judge would respond. There was a subtle tension in the air, the kind that comes when every word, every gesture can tip the balance of power. Judge Hargrave's eyes narrowed as she examined the documents, her fingers drumming impatiently on the bench. "This evidence," she said sharply, "may or may not be relevant. We will see if it holds any weight in the context of the proceedings." Her tone was clipped, but there was a flicker of hesitation, a sign that even the most experienced judge could sense the courtroom's shifting energy. The audience murmured softly, sensing the undercurrent of challenge. Claire Donovan placed the evidence carefully on the table, then turned to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "would you like to highlight key points from these documents for the court?" Keanu nodded slightly, his calm demeanor never faltering. He stood and walked to the front of the table, his presence commanding attention. With clarity and precision, he explained the evidence, pointing out details that directly contradicted the judge's earlier assumptions and supported the credibility of the witness's testimony. The courtroom reaction was immediate. Spectators leaned forward, gasps of astonishment punctuated the silence, and reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing the gravity of the revelations. Even the lawyers on the other side exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware that Keanu's composed explanation had made a powerful impact. The audience felt the courtroom tilt subtly toward him, toward reason, calm and truth, rather than intimidation and theatrics. Judge Hargrave, now visibly rattled, attempted to interject, banging the gavel sharply. "Enough! Mr. Reeves, this is not your stage. Please stick to the facts and refrain from theatrics." Her voice carried frustration, but it lacked the commanding force it had earlier. Keanu paused, looked at the judge calmly, and said, "Your Honor, I am presenting facts. This is not theatrics. It is truth, documented and verifiable." His composed firmness drew murmurs of approval from the audience, further undermining the judge's attempts at authority. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on Keanu Reeves, who stood with measured poise, the subtle weight of authority radiating from him. The previous exchanges, his calm composure, the witness testimony, and the evidence presented by his lawyer had shifted the energy in the room. But now it was the moment that could define the entire trial. Judge Veronica Hargrave, visibly tense, leaned forward, her hands gripping the edges of the bench. The gavel rested untouched, as if even she knew it could not command the atmosphere at this moment. Keanu took a slow, deliberate breath, his eyes sweeping over the courtroom before settling on the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm yet resonant, "we are gathered here under the premise of justice. It is not a stage for personal attacks nor a theater for sarcasm or intimidation. The truth, the facts, and the evidence presented are what this court should uphold. Nothing more, nothing less." The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. Spectators leaned forward, some with hands clasped nervously, others exchanging glances that communicated awe and disbelief. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture not only the content of his statement, but the power and precision with which it was delivered. Even opposing lawyers paused, acknowledging the undeniable clarity and authority Keanu's words carried. He continued, his tone unwavering. "I respect this court. I respect the position you hold, Your Honor, but respect is mutual. Disrespect, regardless of where it comes from, cannot be tolerated in a room devoted to truth. If justice is our goal, then every action, every word must serve that purpose. Anything else undermines the very foundation of this courtroom." The effect was immediate and electrifying. Judge Hargrave's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure faltering in the face of such direct, yet respectfully delivered confrontation. The audience could sense the shift in power, not from aggression, but from presence, dignity, and reason. Whispers of astonishment spread through the room as spectators recognized the quiet dominance Keanu now held. For the first time in the trial, the courtroom's collective energy had fully aligned with him. Some fans audibly gasped, while others leaned back in their seats wide-eyed, as though witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but a historic moment in which charisma, intellect, and calm authority had triumphed over intimidation. The press, fully aware of the cinematic potential of the moment, captured every subtle expression, the slight tilt of Keanu's head, the steady calm in his eyes, the judge's barely concealed frustration. Even Judge Hargrave seemed momentarily frozen, her voice caught somewhere between outrage and incredulity. Keanu's words had struck a nerve, yet they had done so without raising a finger or raising his voice. The courtroom was fully in awe, recognizing that the trial had transformed into a stage where integrity and... The gavel finally fell, though its sound seemed almost muted compared to the electric tension that still lingered in the courtroom. Judge Veronica Hargrave sat back in her chair, her face a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and reluctant acknowledgement. The courtroom, once dominated by her authority, now seemed to belong, in spirit at least, to Keanu Reeves. Every spectator, lawyer, and member of the press had felt the subtle yet unmistakable shift in power. Keanu remained seated for a moment, letting the weight of the courtroom's collective attention settle around him. He allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod toward his lawyer, Claire Donovan, acknowledging the teamwork that had supported his poised and measured response throughout the trial. The audience, sensing that the climax had passed and resolution was near, began to stir quietly, whispering in awe at what they had just witnessed. Some exchanged incredulous glances, still processing the sheer composure and dignity Keanu had displayed under direct insult. The judge, regaining a measure of control, attempted to continue proceedings, but her voice lacked its previous edge. Every word she spoke was now carefully measured, as though the courtroom itself constrained her authority. Spectators leaned forward, whispering excitedly among themselves, acknowledging the rare spectacle of a high-profile individual maintaining integrity while facing blatant disrespect from a figure of power. Cameras clicked, recording every expression and subtle movement. Preserving the historic nature of the trial for posterity, Keanu rose slowly from his seat, his posture immaculate, his movements deliberate. The courtroom seemed to sense the significance of each step, the tension hanging in the air like charged static. Spectators instinctively straightened in their seats, some holding their breath, as though the very act of him leaving would mark the final confirmation of the shift in dynamics. He walked toward the exit with quiet confidence, each step echoing softly against the polished floors, the press following closely, capturing the scene from every angle. As he passed the judge, Keanu offered a subtle nod, not of submission, but of acknowledgmenta. gesture of respect, despite the tension that had defined their interaction. The room responded almost instinctively. Murmurs of admiration filled the air. Fans whispered his name in awe, and reporters continued their furious note-taking. The courtroom had been transformed from a simple venue of legal proceedings into a stage of dignity, presence, and quiet triumph. Once Keanu stepped outside, the sunlight hit his face, highlighting the calm triumph in his expression. Fans pressed forward, capturing photos and videos while reporters shouted questions that went largely unanswered. Though a small, polite smile acknowledged the crowd, the moment was not one of overt celebration, but of understated victory, a testament to poise, restraint, and the power of presence over theatrics and insult.